A Tall and Small Collection, Chapter 19, Bandages and Glue. There were countless minutes of silent glances between the two borrower brothers as Soren washed away the blood from Dorian's wounds. The bleeding was not as profuse as before, but the once clean water was now some shade of reddish pink. Dorian, for the most part, had stopped crying as hard as before, but tears still gathered from time to time around his red, puffy eyes. He sat on the edge of the bowl as Soren worked on cleaning his injuries. Soren wanted to explain how Ashlynn had helped him. He wanted to explain that he had made a deal and that Ashlynn, a human, listened and responded to his requests. He wanted to ease his brother's mind, but he could only worry about Ray and reassure Dorian that they were going to be okay. The wounds, now cleaned, didn't seem as bad as Soren initially suspected. There were a few deeper punctures and scratches which would leave scars, and it was obviously traumatizing for Dorian, but Soren was glad Dorian was out of danger for the moment. Dorian still looked eerily pale and needed bandages, food, and rest. Those things would come soon. The sound of the door opening snapped both of them to attention. Dorian instinctively whimpered and stumbled forward off of the edge of the glass bowl and behind Soren, latching onto his arm and peering out from behind his shoulder. At the same time, Soren instinctually pulled Dorian behind his own body, despite the fact he trusted Ashlynn, wrapping his arm backwards around Dorian. Old habits die hard, he thought as he forced his body to relax. Ashlynn stepped into the main room and carefully closed the door behind her, a rush of cold air following close behind. From the floor, Soren couldn't see anything specific in her hands. Then he spotted a small, rectangular tray no bigger than her palm. The look on her face was difficult to read. Then it shifted into a mixture of two emotions. One of them was a pang of sadness, while the other had a hopeful gleam. She flashed a partial smile at the two of them as she stepped forward. Dorian whimpered again as Ashlynn approached. Soren couldn't take it. He looked up at Ashlynn and called to her. "Did you find him? Is he all right?" The pain in Soren's heart burst into relief as he watched Ashlynn nod and carefully kneel, the whole time keeping the small rectangular tray as level as possible. "He's okay, but he's really stuck on here. I need to get some things. Be careful. You don't want to get stuck too," said Ashlynn, her voice much lower than normal. She lowered her hand onto the ground and set the tray near him. Soren felt like he had been punched in the gut. Ray was, as Ashlynn said, really stuck onto the glue trap. It looked like he had fallen face first into the sticky substance. He was wearing the pelt, and Soren couldn't see his face, but he could hear his brother's quivering sobs. Ashlynn retracted her hand and inched her way to the kitchen to retrieve the necessary supplies to unstick the small boy. She had to use her phone to search for those supplies first. In the meantime, Soren disregarded the potential hazards of the sticky substance and stepped forward to lay his hands on his brother's back. Soren could hear his heart-breaking sobs and the poor attempt to stifle those sobs. He attempted to thrash away from Soren's touch, which broke his heart. Did Ray think he was being touched by a human? And that was why he was shying away? "Ray, it's okay. It's me. It's Soren. You're going to be okay." Soren began rubbing his brother's back, unable to think of what else he could say or do. Ray's struggles instantly ceased. "Soren?" Ray's already tiny voice, muffled by the pelt, was barely audible. There was another round of attempted thrashing as Ray attempted to break free from the glue's grasp to see his oldest brother. His inability to break free set off another round of panicked breaths. I can't get out." Dorian, still clinging to Soren, began shaking his shoulder. "Soren, we need to leave. We need to get out of here before the human comes back," Dorian whimpered. "Soren, I was seen." Ray was no longer trying to break free, obviously exhausted. Instead, Ray tried arching his back to press himself into Soren's hands, as if the contact of Soren's touch were keeping him grounded. Are we captured? I don't want to be a pet." Soren had to take a moment and breathe. This wasn't going to be easy. Conveying to his brothers that they were going to be safe and that the human 6 feet away wasn't going to put them in some kind of cage wasn't going to be easy. He remembered what he made them promise before their first borrowing mission, and so he decided to rely on that. "Both of you, listen to me," said Soren calmly. "I told you once that while we're out here, you have to listen to me, that you had to trust me. Do you still trust me?" Both brothers' demeanor shifted to uncertain, and, for a moment, Soren felt his stomach drop. Did they not trust him anymore? Thankfully, after a breathless moment, both boys nodded as best they could. There was still uncertainty, but Soren could work with what little he had. "You have to trust me now. Ashlynn, the human over there, won't hurt us." Dorian shifted uncomfortably and Ray whimpered. Soren continued, interrupting their mental spiraling. "Listen to me. I've been out here on my own for a few weeks now, and we have an arrangement. She listens to me and won't do anything without permission. We're going to be okay." Dorian opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something, looking timid at his eldest brother's words. Soren, with a gentle glance, took the words from him. "I made a promise to protect you, both of you. It's okay. We're going to be okay." Before Soren could say anything else, Ashlynn's voice seized their attention. Evidently, she had been listening in and waiting for an opportunity to interject. "Soren, I figured out how to get him unstuck. May I approach? This is going to take a while," said Ashlynn. Dorian repositioned himself nervously so that he was pressed into Soren's left side. Soren could feel Dorian's hands trembling and heard Ray's muttering over and over, "No, no, no." Soren steeled himself and turned back to Ashlynn. "Can you give us another minute, Ashlynn, please?" Soren asked, keeping his voice calm and clear. He needed to show his brothers that Ashlynn was going to listen, and now was the perfect time to do it. Ashlynn took a second before nodding. "Sure, I just thought you'd want to get Ray free as soon as possible. Just give a shout when you're ready, okay?" asked Ashlynn. Soren smiled and nodded. "Will do, thank you," he said gratefully. Then a thought came to mind. "Actually, could you cut some more bandages so they're not so big? I want to wrap Dorian's arm into back." Ashlynn nodded after seeing the situation and retrieved her first aid kit once again and began cutting strips of bandages as thin as she could. Dorian marveled at this interaction. His brother, always fearless and calm, had just spoken to a human and commanded her to listen and perform a task. More importantly, she listened. Dorian, not keeping his eyes off of the human, listened as Soren continued to try and calm and soothe Ray and evaluate how best to get him off of the trap. Several minutes passed in this odd mixture of silence and soothing until Ashlynn cleared her throat and waved to get Soren's attention. "Soren, are you all good?" asked Ashlynn. Soren felt his muscles stiffen, heart still racing. He knew his brothers probably wanted Ashlynn to stay away. They probably wanted to go back into the walls and never see this or any human again. Despite what his brothers wanted, this needed to be done. With a reassuring smile to Dorian, Soren turned back to Ashlynn and nodded. "Yes, we're good. We're going to be okay," said Soren calmly. Dorian flinched while Ray whimpered. "We're going to be okay. Listen to me. We're going to be fine." Soren continued to repeat this mantra as Ashlynn approached. Ashlynn laid the bandages near Soren and held a bowl of something in her hand along with a few pieces of cloth. The liquid was a strange yellow color and had an odd sheen to it. The human towered over the three borrowers as she stepped around them and sat down beside them. Dorian trembled as he realized that Ashlynn was sitting less than a foot away. Dorian could see the threads in her pants. He could see the creases in her knuckles as her hand was mere inches from them. He wanted to scream and run for the walls, but Soren remained unmoving. His oldest brother wasn't even shaking. How could he be so unafraid? Was this because the human changed him? Or was this the fearless older brother he had always known? Seeing the look in Soren's eye, Dorian no longer had a doubt. This was his fearless brother. He didn't want to leave Soren. He couldn't leave Soren. Not again. He couldn't go back to being alone with Ray, trying to live. He wanted to be brave like Soren. Even if they were captured, at least they were together. "Soren," Ashlynn said softly, "I remember our rules and agreements, but you're going to need help getting your brother unstuck." Ray sniffled and thrashed against the glue uselessly. "Ray, it's okay. You're okay," reassured Soren as he rubbed his brother's back. "Ashlynn, what do you propose? How are we going to get him unstuck?" "We need to rub this oil around his body and massage it along the limbs. We also need to make sure his face isn't covered. I can't just pour the oil, like the internet is telling me to do, into the tray because I can't see how close his face is to the glue. It's just a bad idea. If we can get him unstuck mostly around his limbs, I can help lift him out," said Ashlynn. "You need to bandage your brother, and you don't want to get stuck yourself. So, I can help with the oil if you'll let me." Soren didn't like the idea of Ashlynn holding his youngest brother or pinching his clothes to lift him out, but there was little else Soren could do. He remembered that minutes ago he had willingly jumped into Ashlynn's hands for the first time. He recalled her gentle touch and the warmth of her palms, feeling the beating of her heart beneath his hands. The borrower had even been lifted and carried in her grasp while he was unconscious numerous times, all without injury. It wasn't a bad experience, but he had taken 2 weeks to acclimatize to Ashlynn's presence and having her hands near him. At the same time, he couldn't lift Ray out of the tray on his own. "If it comes to it, and there's no other way," Soren started, "then you can help, but I think helping with the oil will be enough." "Sounds good," she muttered. "Just let me know." They watched as Ashlynn poured some oil onto a few rags, handed a piece of one to Soren, and keeping one for herself, and began rubbing the cloth around Ray's limbs. Soren took a few minutes to temporarily bandage Dorian's wounds on his arms, side, back, and a scrape on his leg. They would need a full bath before properly bandaging these injuries, but this was good enough for now. After nearly 2 hours of painstakingly careful work and numerous pauses so Soren could console Ray and Dorian, Ray began to pull free. His arm came free first, and his tiny hands instantly clutched onto Soren's hand. His other arm and leg came free next. His torso began to wiggle free, and, after a minor debate, Soren allowed Ashlynn to tilt the trap vertically so he could grab onto his brother and pull. Soren dipped his arms into the oil and managed to force his arms under his brother's chest. It was incredibly sticky, and Soren worried that his pulling wouldn't be able to get Ray free. He heaved with all his might backward as Ashlynn kept the glue trap firmly in place. There was a harsh pop of a suctioning sound, and, finally, Ray came free. They toppled to the ground in a sticky heap, and in an instant Ray turned around and buried his face into Soren's chest, sobbing and shaking. Dorian quickly joined in, piling onto the adhesive mound. The younger brothers spent several minutes in Soren's arms, simply enjoying the embrace of their eldest brother. Soren let his body relax into their embraces. He had never been so worried about them. Though the circumstance wasn't ideal, at least Soren could watch after them again. He looked up into Ashlynn's blue-gray eyes, noting her smile at their tender moment, and mouthed, "Thank you." Ashlynn seemed to be beaming with pride at this simple expression of gratitude, but she simply nodded in response, afraid she might shatter the moment if she were to speak. After another minute, she asked if they wanted to take a second and get clean and get something to eat, to which Soren agreed. Ashlynn gave them some crackers while she ran a shallow sink of warm water with bubbles. A warm bubble bath was something the brothers had only experienced a few times in their entire lives, though getting in the bathroom was the real challenge. Ashlynn had to wait patiently for Soren to coax his brothers into the box so they could be lifted onto the bathroom counter. Soren wrapped his leg in something called plastic wrap, according to Ashlynn, and joined his brothers in the sink to help clean wounds and dirt and grime. They didn't speak, and spent most of their time recuperating in the slightly steaming water. Ashlynn had some soap and a cloth for them to scrub with before leaving the room and sitting outside the door, waiting for a cue to return. Once they were clean, they dried themselves and dressed in some of the clothes Soren had stitched together as spare outfits. They were horribly bulky on the boys, but perhaps that was part of the charm. Soren called for Ashlynn after they were dressed, bandaged, and in the box. She came in, a wary smile on her face, as she carefully transferred them back to her room to the familiar place on her bedside table. Ashlynn brought 2 additional makeshift bed materials and set them in the box near Soren's bed for them to use. Seeing 4 additional eyes watching her timidly before ducking away to hide under the covers was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. They were all exhausted, but also reluctant to be the first asleep. Ashlynn left a small light on at Soren's request before slipping into her own bed and lying down. The calm sounds of breathing filled the room within minutes. The moment she was asleep, both Dorian and Ray slipped out of their own cots and crammed into Soren's bed, tucking themselves under his shoulders and pressing themselves against him. "Soren?" Ray's tiny voice penetrated the low-lit room. "I'm scared." Soren wrapped his arms tighter around his brother's, exhaling long and hard. "I know you are," he whispered before lifting his head up and pressing his cheek to the top of his brother's head. "But it's okay. We're okay. I'm not going to let anything else happen to you. Ever." Soren felt Dorian shift to look up at him. "What's going to happen to us? Do you think she'll put us in a cage?" "No," said Soren. "We're okay." He paused. "Do you want me to stay up and make sure?" Both brothers shifted and laid closer to him. It was a wordless reply to Soren's question. "Okay." "We missed you, Soren," muttered Ray. "We wanted to come back. We wanted to rescue you, but..." "Shh," Soren soothed. "It's okay. Just get some sleep. We'll talk after a long rest. I'll stay up." "All night?" asked Dorian. "All night," replied Soren. "I love you both so much." Eventually, the brothers drifted off to sleep, and eventually Soren found a brief moment of rest, yet refused to slip into unconsciousness. He couldn't fail his brothers again. He would not allow it.